Hello audience, Mr. Z here with a much anticipated alternate history scenario for you. What if France and Britain united as one superstate? There are numerous opportunities throughout history for this to have taken place, but we'll be taking the scenario right from World War II, when the French government was forced to flee the nation in exile after Hitler's invasion of Paris. They had fled to London, where considerations were made for a Franco-British union to strengthen the nation's post-war and boost morale and organization. Unfortunately, discussions over France's role were misinterpreted by some, with Britain attempting to capture French territory for itself, and thus was scrapped, with the claim that France would rather be a Nazi province than a British dominion. However, following the Allied victory, the French government came to realize the sheer magnitude of the damage dealt to France, so much that concerns arose of uprising and rebellion. This would only be further emphasized by a loss of Vietnam and Algeria. Britain itself would also begin to lose its grip on its colonies, granting India independence and losing authority in Egypt. In our timeline, this imperial decay was nearly averted when France, Britain, and Israel united to capture Egypt and seize control of the Suez Canal, in what would become known as the Suez Crisis. However, Britain and France would be forced to stand down by the US to prevent potential large-scale conflict with the Soviets, unknowingly hammering in the final nail in the coffin for the French and English empires. But now we ask, what if? What if France and Britain had decided to unite immediately following World War II? Could all of this have been averted? As it turns out, it might have. For one, the French homeland was in much worse condition than the UK, infrastructure was in shambles, the French currency was devalued over 50%, and the trying task of restoring order was in the hands of Charles de Gaulle, who simply wouldn't have the immediate authority to put France back on track for another decade. But by pooling their resources, moving the French governing body to Britain, and creating an organized effort to rebuild the foundations of the nations, the two could be back on track much sooner than in our timeline. An immediate result of the scenario would be the loss of any plans for the EU, as it was the product of French efforts to secure its existence and a place as a dominant force within Europe after plans for the Franco-British Union turned up empty. However, if the FBU turned up successful, France would have no reason to propose an alliance with Germany. The years following World War II would see a stiff transition period of integration, as well as a grueling but brief period of restabilization, after which the primary directive of the Franco-British Union would be to reassert direct military influence within the colonies. This would mean a securing of African colonies, and even laying claim to former German, Italian, and independent sectors of the continent. But fully withdrawing from Indochina would have put too much of a strain on the combined military. While this may appear like a setback, withdrawing from Indochina would mean a consolidation of troops to the immediate vicinity where they are most needed, freeing up a hand that would otherwise be guarding a far-off asset. The Franco-British Union would be on the path of taking its role as the sole European superpower, especially once it's developed nuclear weapons, which Britain had accomplished in our timeline by 1952. This would allow the FBU to demonstrate further autonomy from either side of the Cold War and operate with less oversight from the US. The Union's only true weakness at this point would have been its economy, with a currency which even at this point couldn't compare well to the American dollar, and a government who's massively indebted to the US, who would have contributed significantly to the reconstruction process. The economy would face another potential hiccup as control over Egypt began to wane, and an event similar to that which led to the Suez Crisis in our timeline would begin to threaten a major Franco-British shipping path, something which could deal a massive blow to the Union's economy. The proposed solution would be an invasion by the FBU and Israel, something which the US and Canada, just as in our timeline, would condemn and attempt to subvert. However, unlike in our timeline, would be met by resistance by France and Britain, asserting that they are in fact the superpowers of Europe, and the US is meddling in foreign affairs it holds no ground in, leading to something akin to the Sino-Soviet split between the US and Franco-British Union, who would go on to withdraw from NATO and enter the Cold War as a third superpower with its own agenda of restoring Europe to a pre-Great War glory, establishing a number of alliances with other European nations through the promise of land holdings within Africa. I suppose you could argue that the Franco-British Union was competing in the Cold War for the name of imperialism, doing so as a means to justify its own actions and existence, and to prove that the British system of colonization and conquest worked, but was thrown into disarray by the two great wars. That a constitutional empire is the most reliable form of government and can offer its people both security and liberty, something the US and USSR claim could only exist in one extreme or another. This would lead to a gradual estrangement between the FBU and the US, leading the US to form closer ties with Canada, who would begin to distance itself from Britain and its controversial stance. As the Americas and Europe seemingly become steadfast in their political stances, the two begin securing their land holdings, assimilating continental territories while deporting those sympathetic to other ideologies. In essence, the US and FBU do not actually hate each other, but simply thought the other was wrong, and thus agreed to disagree in a way that would prevent any future conflicts on foreign soil. The two would sign a non-aggression pact and agree to stay out of each other's business so long as the Soviet Union wasn't involved. The following decades would see the nations grow and expand within their own sectors, soon losing influence abroad, forcing them to focus on reinforcing local territories, stockpiling massive numbers of nuclear weapons, and generally advancing their nation. The Soviet sector boasting the largest mass production industry of the three, but falling far behind in standards of living and technology, the former being claimed by the imperial sector, and the latter being dominated by the American sector. Things overall would be quite different than the world we know today, with imperialism surviving well into the 21st century, but soon facing the question of, where do we go from here? And I'll leave that for you to decide. Thank you all for watching, be sure to like the video if you enjoyed it, and subscribe for more. Mr. Z, out.